So this was a collaboration between several institutions, two of which are from the project. So FBK from Italy and our faculty from Skopje. And then also we had some assistance and some collaboration with several institutions from the United States. The discussion today is going to focus on vital signs as a source of racial bias. Briefly, we're going to see the motivation for our research, after which we will define our problem and then the methodology used. In the end, I will present our results and discuss their meaning. Now, if there is an overused phrase in research regarding artificial intelligence, then it must be something akin to with the rapid development of AI and so on. So it feels a little bit of cliche to open this seminar with a line like that. However, with the rapid development of artificial intelligence and the efficiency which it offers, there are entire industries which rely on its application in solving everyday tasks. Advantageously, AI is a part of a vast range of actively used applications, and we have applications in everything from social media to personalized recommender systems, and then all the way to smart homes, smart cars, surveillance, and so on. The benefits of this are manifold. Unfortunately, with the good also comes the bad. So social media recommender systems use information to influence and shape their users' opinions to an alarming degree. Smart homes, smart cars are all relying on devices which have security flaws and can be hacked and so on. Now, considering these disadvantages, and when I say disadvantages, that is a very, very light word usage here. So considering these disadvantages, we come to the question, with AI having a high tolerance threshold or a high error margin, what happens when that same artificial intelligence is employed in areas as is medicine? And artificial intelligence is used in medical applications. Widely applied in medical setting, everything from patient care to medical records and billing. And it is important to just note that artificial intelligence in medicine is used in applications which directly or indirectly determine the treatment and the outcome of a patient in different ways. For example, one of the main applications of artificial intelligence nowadays is the identification and diagnosis of different diseases. A sub-branch of this is medical image diagnosis, where artificial intelligence are taught to recognize complex patterns in imaging data and give health assessments for patients, which as a diagnostic tool has had large success in the past years. Other applications include, but are not limited to, personalized medicine, smart healthcare records, clinical trial and research, drug discovery and manufacturing, and so on. So this brings us to our motivation. As with all active applications, it is expected that issues can arise since technology is prone to different forms of malfunction. But of all potential problems that exist, there are some which are in ways deadlier than others because they're silent or hidden problems, and by hidden, often in plain sight. This means that they exist even though they're an unintentional, unexpected byproduct of the process. Most often, these resulting byproducts have a negative connotation. And since they're unexpected, one can understand why they were not detected immediately, especially when they happen for the first time. However, after manifold occurrences, now the research world should know better. Such cases of silent or hidden problems are exemplary different forms of bias that have occurred in medical applications. One example is socioeconomic bias. Now, there was a study which assessed the degree to which data quality in electronic health records related to socioeconomic status. What they did was they basically used machine learning models to predict asthma exacerbation in children. And the results of that study showed that lower socioeconomic status was associated with worse predictive model performance. Another form of bias that is present in medical applications is linguistic bias. In Canada, there was a development of an artificial intelligence model which used audio data to diagnose Alzheimer's. However, the model was trained on a limited range of accents, or rather just one. So basically, the training process included speech samples from Canadian English speakers only, therefore rendering the application completely unusable for everyone else in the country. So these are some different types of bias present. Today, our main focus is going to be racial bias. So first, I want to talk about the unequal treatment of patients depending on race and ethnicity. There have been detailed accounts of evident cases in which patients are just treated differently because of their race and ethnicity. Now, this is just further worsened by the fact that the bias present there is most often called unconscious bias. And while sometimes that may be the case, in many situations, that so-called unconscious bias is actually distinctively visible in healthcare providers' expectations and attitudes and behavior towards patients. What is also, this is a problem in itself, but what is also even worse that what is also worse is the fact that sorry? Oh, somebody made a blunder. Okay, so what is worse is that this bias can be considered even worse when we remember that it is something that can also be taught to students. Now, this is the focus of an opinion piece, which defines the entire process as a so-called silent curriculum. This opinion piece states that among two patients in pain, waiting in an emergency department examination room, the white patient is more likely to get medication, and the Black patient is more likely to be discharged with a note documenting narcotic-seeking behavior. Now, this bias, because this is bias, and it's an obvious bias, this bias also can be inadvertently transferred to electronic health records. In fact, there was a study which analyzed material of physical notes from patients where they looked for negative descriptors. So, for example, they looked if a patient or the patient's behavior was described as resistant or non-compliant, and so on. And the result from this study concluded that Black patients are 2.5 times more likely to have one or more negative descriptors in their electronic health records compared to white patients. Now, this is a huge, huge problem. These biased decisions, this bias present in medical decisions is a human factor. And as such, it can be present in different types of trials that result in producing widely used data sets. As a consequence, these data sets turn out to be biased, and they're either full of biased markers or have underrepresentation of certain racial or ethnical group. Now, working with biased data sets obviously is going to negatively influence the development of a machine learning assisted application. Namely, that bias can transfer from the data set to the application, and consequently, there have been many reports of detected racial bias in medical application. What happens is that the trained algorithms just basically reinforce existing health inequities arising from structural racism in everything from cancer detection algorithms that are less effective for Black patients to cardiac risk scores that underestimate the amount of care that is needed by a Black patient, and even with maternal health, where algorithms predict lower successful VBAC rates for pregnant people or women of color. Another particular case related to an actively used algorithm, which is just given in the middle of a slide because it was an uproar at the time, was an actively used algorithm in medical setting, which had problem and impacted decisions for over 200 million people in the United States. So the study which investigated this approach found evidence of racial bias such that Black patients, which were assigned the same level of risk by the algorithms, were much sicker compared to white patients. Now, according to the findings of this study, the bias occurred because the algorithm used health costs instead of the actual information that it needed to use as a proxy for the health that was needed. Now, since less money was being spent on Black patients who have the same level of need, the algorithm just falsely concluded that Black patients are healthier than equally sick white patients and just worked in an incorrect way. Now, an estimation was given by this study, and it showed that the number of Black patients identified for extra care by this algorithm were reduced by more than half compared to what the number should have been in the first place. Now, the discussion of the importance of detecting racial bias in medical applications, understanding the sources which create that bias, as well as the needed strategies to improve the fairness of the final algorithm or just avoid creating biased applications in the first place, can be an entire seminar by itself, so I will not dedicate a lot of time on that. However, I want to address just briefly from a developer point of view, during the engineering of ML pipelines, typically there is a data pre-processing phase where variables which can potentially introduce bias, such as race and ethnicity, are excluded. Now, in a way, this guarantees that the algorithm just will not rely on these attributes for the purpose that it's meant to do, so for classification of diseases or prediction of patient state or optimization of personalized medicine and so on. An additional preventive measure, of course, would be just to check the model's performance amongst racial and ethnic groups. Now, if the model significantly underperforms in some groups, then additional measures have to be taken in order to ensure an equitable performance. There have been a lot of studies where racial bias was detected through observing the model's performance across race and ethnicity. Now, all these reported cases of bias, which I so quickly went through right now, are basically the reason why we wanted to investigate whether just basic routine measurement of vital signs can be a potential source of racial bias, and therefore in AI-based applications using those signs. Now, normally, when it comes to vital signs such as oxygen saturation and blood pressure and heart rate and respiratory rate, as well as body temperature, they're supposed to be all objective measures, and therefore they should be considered unbiased and net neutral with respect to ethnicity, race, general demographics, and so on. However, that is actually no longer the case with blood oxygen saturation. Blood oxygen saturation was one of the important unbiased measures of hypoxemia. However, following a series of studies, blood oxygen saturation is now under intense scrutiny because these studies revealed that measurement bias exists, meaning that there was a design flaw in the pulse oximetry, and therefore the measurements were inaccurate. Now, these design flaws resulted in underdetection of low oxygen levels in patients with darker skin compared to patients with lighter skin, and therefore created a delayed treatment for basic care for Black and Hispanic patients. So, coming to our study. The definition which we established for our problem was basically Is it possible to identify patients' self-reported ethnicity when applying machine learning algorithms to patient vital signs from the first 24 hours after admission in the ICU? In order to address the problem, for our purposes, we use the EICU Collaborative Research Database, which has around 200,000 admissions from 335 ICUs across 208 hospitals in the United States. Now, the reason why we chose this data set is because it fulfilled two very important requirements which we were looking for, and those are that we had constant measurement of patient vital signs, as well as we had detailed records on a patient's self-reported ethnicity. How we did what we did. During our data pre-processing stage, we selected all adult patients, so ages 18 and above, that were alive within the first 24 hours after being admitted in the ICU and had at least one clinically valid measurement for all the vital signs considered for this study. So we were looking into the heart rate, the invasive and non-invasive oxygen saturation, the respiratory rate, and the invasive and the non-invasive blood pressure. And from blood pressure, we were looking into systolic, diastolic, and mean. Now, our patient selection is described on the left picture. Or basically what I just said is given in the left picture in more detail. Now, we focused on the first 24 hours since they were the most medically relevant, and biased decisions during this critical time generally tend to carry the most harm. From the vital signs which we considered, we extracted several statistical features: mean, minimum, maximum, and a variance. Additionally, patients which had a missing admission diagnosis, age, gender, or Apache severity score were excluded from the study. Now, after we applied all our data requirements, we obtained the final cohort for the study. We decided to focus on the three most dominant groups, so white, Black, and Hispanic patients. The EICU had additional two ethnic groups, Asian American and Native American. However, our patient selection process made it so that the number of patients in these two groups was significantly lower. So since the data was scarce, consequently, these population groups were not included in this study. In the end, our final data set consisted of 10,763 patient admissions, of which 85% were white patients, only 10% were Black patients, and 5% were Hispanic patients. Now, even these numbers give the picture, so it is obvious that this data set was just highly imbalanced in favor of white patients, which is why we decided to apply a matching criteria. So we used patients from racial and ethnic groups, or Black and Hispanic patients, because there were less patient admissions with Black and Hispanic patients, to devise a matched cohort of the same size with the patients from the most present group, so the most patient admission number, highest patient admission number, which were the white patients. The matching criteria was initially a point of discussion. We started the matching process by considering three features: age, gender, and admission diagnosis. However, patients with the same age, gender, and diagnosis can have different disease severity score, which can affect their vital signs. And therefore, we decided to also include the Apache score as a matching criteria as well. Now, the matching process had several steps, which are in details given on the right picture at this slide. Now, initially, we check if there is a match where the admission diagnosis and the gender correspond, whereas the difference between ages is not above 5, and the difference between the Apache scores is not above 2.5. If no match was found, then we extended the pool of candidate patients such that we considered the Apache score difference had to be below 2.5, and the diagnosis had to be same, but either the same gender or an age difference below 5 was a requirement. Again, if no match was found, our final step was the candidate patient was selected from those patients who have the same admission diagnosis and an Apache 4 score difference no greater than 2.5, whereas gender and age were just not considered anymore. If any of these 3 steps produced a match, those 2 patients would be included in the cohort. Otherwise, there would be no patient that was going to go included in the cohort. Now, we started with quite a large data set in the beginning. However, we ended with a very reduced cohort. Just to illustrate, there was around 20,000 admissions of Black patients in the original data set, and we ended up with around 1,000 of those. So this is one active challenge basically in AI in medicine in general, not just our research. It is that artificial intelligence just requires a lot of data, first because the model's needed, and also because after applying the selection criteria, the data was very, very limited. However, we continued with the matched cohort as such, and when it comes to the model development, we compared the performance of 2.5 algorithms, basically. Now, what does that mean? It means that we looked into the logistic regression as a baseline model, and then we looked at 2 different versions of XGBoost. One was the default version, and one was an optimized version for which we obtained the hyperparameters just using a random search. We performed internal validation. So we had stratified 5-fold cross-validation, and therefore our model was derived on 80% of the data, and then it was validated on the remaining 20% of the data. In order to understand what our model is doing and why is it performing the way it is, we used CHOP, which is just a popular method to provide variable ranking for the model predictions. Now, with regard to results, there are quite a few separate tests which we performed. I won't stop for a detailed explanation of all of them, but I will give an overall highlight of all the important comparisons, and then just we can draw conclusions in the discussion portion later. Now, in order to provide a starting point on the research topic, initially, we investigated the presence of racial bias in the overall patient cohort and used all the selected vital signs as input variables for the model. Now, the entire analysis was conducted on 3 separate groups. The first group was the Black and white group, where we had 1,688 patients. Then we had the Hispanic and the white group with 784 patients, and the Hispanic and the Black group with 444 patients corresponding. So in order just to give you an idea about the cohorts here and what we have in them, we have matched patients. We already saw the process earlier, so I'm not going to go back to that. Just I want to point out that we have matched patients from each ethnicity, which in a way correspond to each other, in the sense that in the 1,688 patients, half of them are Black, half of them are white patients. Each Black patient was linked to a white patient with the same or proximal Apache score, age, diagnosis, and gender. So therefore, the final group are patients which are supposed to be in similar medical conditions, in the sense that their severity scores should indicate similar progression of their corresponding disease and so on. Now, our analysis of the groups showed that the XGBoost algorithm can predict patients' race from vital signs with a performance of 0.74 area under the curve for the first group, 0.63 for the second group and 0.75 for the third group. What this means is that basically we have better performance when vital signs of Black and white patients are compared. And then when vital signs of Hispanic and Black patients are compared, that also stands. However, there is a light decrease in performance when we compare Hispanic and white patients. These results indicate the presence of racial bias in vital signs, which just prompted further investigations after that. The first thing that we wanted to do is understand where that bias originates from. So in response to that, we performed a saliency analysis using the SHAP methodology, just to rank our variables as important by the model. Now, the SHAP is given in the image on the right, as you can see. In it, it revealed that oxygen saturation measured through pulse oximetry was the most influential variable in predicting patients' race. Now, in this initial group, we had patients which had different diseases. So some had heart failure, others had sepsis, and so on. And therefore, our next step was to see if this model performance would be affected if we only focused on one specific patient comorbidity. So for that purpose, we performed the same analysis in the 5 topmost present comorbidities in the dataset, or in our cohort, basically. We looked at patients with sepsis, essential hypertension, heart failure, acute kidney failure, and chronic kidney disease. So we performed 5 separate tests, and every single one of those tests showed similar predictive performance, with the exception of heart failure. Now, additionally, for these results, we also performed the saliency analysis here. So we also had SHAP investigation, and it also again showed that oxygen saturation measured through pulse oximetry was the most influential variable again. Therefore, our next step was to understand why oxygen saturation was so important. Thus, our analysis focused on investigating pulse oximetry and consequently vital signs measurement technology as a potential generator of racial bias. So we focused on obtaining results from 2 separate investigations, which address 2 distinct potential sources. First, we looked at the potential bias that oxygen saturation measurements and pulse oximetry had, and then we looked at the potential bias of blood pressure measurements and using an arm cuff. Now, in regard to oxygen saturation, we compared performance of race prediction using oxygen saturations obtained from invasive methods, so from patient lab results, and then also from non-invasive methods, or rather obtained through pulse oximetry. Our findings show that there is a significant bias in values measured through pulse oximetry, since our models predict very well there. On the other hand, the results from the invasively measured oxygen saturation are not as prominent, so they're not as visible. So these results support previous findings where it was shown that measurements of pulse oximetry are affected by patients' skin color. Now, on the other hand, when considering blood pressure, we investigated whether the algorithm can predict patients' race using blood pressure measurements from an arm cuff, which is the non-invasive way, and then we compared these findings using an arterial line, which is the invasive way. In addition, we also did an analysis using both types of measurements. For these tests, we removed the oxygen saturation because we already established presence of bias there, and we did not want oxygen saturation measurements to influence the results of the blood pressure measurements. Now, In contrast to already existing literature about this, our results show that while there is presence of bias in blood pressure measurements, there is no major difference between the values of blood pressure using an arm cuff compared to using an arterial line. Additionally, we also looked into care delivery practices. In order to do this, we extracted frequency information, frequency of measurement of patient vital signs. And we found that with our approach, care delivery practices do not significantly influence prediction of patients' races. These weren't the results we initially expected. However, upon further consideration, maybe this should have been expected because vital signs are measured far more routinely than other variables, and our cohort selection was an extremely specific one due to the requirements of which vital signs measurements this patient should have. Now, this might be one of the reasons why, if bias does exist in care delivery practices, our models were not able to pick up on it. And finally, we investigated other sources of bias, which we did by analyzing only invasively measured vital signs. Now, this is because oxygen saturation and blood pressure measured invasively through an arterial line or through labs are less likely to be influenced by the measurement technology. Consequently, they should more closely just reflect the actual state of the patient in comparison to the non-invasive measurement methods. Now, the results showed that invasively measured vital signs carry some form of bias. It is not as expressed as it was with non-invasive oxygen saturation, but it's still there. So because of that, further investigations are required in order to just at least estimate the actual source of bias here. We don't have anything concrete yet. We just have some hypotheses. One of them is that this is a result of calibration differences in the Apache score between different races, which might influence the results. And another hypothesis is that the selection criteria for patients that got an arterial line put in might also be one thing that influences the results. Either way, so whichever it is, or even if it's something else entirely, this needs to be investigated in detail before actual final conclusions can be drawn about the other sources of bias present. Now, what our main finds prove is that it is possible to predict race and ethnicity using vital signs measurements. This is an important finding because we were able to show presence of bias in the most basic data, which are constantly being used to assess the health status of patients as such. So we already had an idea, because of what we discussed in the beginning, we already had an idea of potential bias in electronic health records and so on. But with this study, we proved further evidence of potential bias that exists in the measurement of critical vital signs collected within the first 24 hours of admission. And this data, which we investigated, is very valuable and used constantly in just providing steps for medical personnel in treating daily interventions to patients, and as such is often used in just building different AI-based applications. Now, while the models which we had did not give a definite, a complete, entirely correct prediction of the ethnicity or race, the success of the model in just classifying 2 out of 3 patients correctly is really just not accidental. And considering the possible repercussions, this is a very, very worrying problem. Now, this is worrying, especially because our machine learning models are only using information from patients' vital signs, and that's statistical information from patient vital signs, suggesting that those statistical features from routinely collected information in the first 24 hours are embedded with information of bias along racial and ethnic disparities. Now, we discussed two different underlying issues concerning measurement technology. We saw the obvious evidence of potential for underlying issues regarding the accuracy of the equipment that is being used all the time. Pulse oximeters have already become known by the fact that their readings are influenced by skin color. But even though we proved presence of bias in pulse oximeters, we also saw some discrepancies in invasively measured oxygen saturation. So this is not, or rather it cannot be entirely attributed to medical equipment. So another thing to consider is the socioeconomic factors that influence that bias. For example, there are patient groups that are economically or socially marginalized, and as such, they usually just have worse access to preventive medical care. Which is why when they're brought to the ICU, they're in a worse condition compared to other population subgroups. Either way, with the medical equipment problems and the socioeconomic factor problems that exist, and despite the fact that there are probably a multitude of potential other sources of bias, the fact remains that there is bias in basic vital signs. And it would not be a stretch to assume that if we can find bias in basic routine measurements of vital signs in just a brief 24-hour window for patients, then that bias is also present in different other more complex types of clinical data. So consequently, a question emerges, and that is the question that I'm gonna leave you with, because it's an important question to think about. So how do we control for that bias? That is all from me. I thank you for your attention, and I leave it now to you for any questions about what I might not have explained.
Thank you, Bojana, for your presentation. Now it's time for questions. We have here Anna. Anna, you are muted.
So can I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
Of course.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Nice presentation. I only didn't understand a couple of issues here. Namely, it has been published already that, for example, from X-rays, it is possible that the deep was able to distinguish nearly 100% the sex of the patient, and about 90% it was able to determine the race of the patient, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that was a publication, if I'm not mistaken, from last year, around July.
Yeah,
that was conducted by scientists from the United States. So one of the co-authors there is working with us for this as well.
Okay, great. But I fail to understand why that should be biased. I mean, I think that was a pretty legal, correct study, and the results seem to be not using word bias. So what exactly do you mean by bias?
What exactly do I mean by bias? Well, basically, there is how do I define this? There are applications that are being developed which perform better for certain groups of people, whether that be based on race or gender or so on, compared to other groups of people. So that is the bias that we're discussing.
So you're trying to say that X-rays are biased, or that heart itself is biased, or what?
we're trying to say that if we look into the heart rate of the patient, due to the problem or potential conflicts with medical treatment and how that heart rate is being measured and monitored, that maybe because of that monitoring, there is some errors that were made, and consequently that measurement is not as accurate as it should have been. So that is the presence of bias.
Okay, thank you.
Pleasure.
Now we have Yuns.
Yeah. Hi, Bojana. I was wondering, you've already touched upon this in the last slide, I think, where you try to interpret sources of this bias. So I was just wondering if you could maybe comment on, since race, you talked about race and ethnicity, and yeah, these are social constructs. Race isn't, inherently physical, or not just that. So I was wondering if you could comment on that, which aspects, because you mentioned socioeconomic status, I think. So how does that pertain to ethnicity or race?
Well, here's the thing. This is a data set which was obtained from a part of ICUs around the United States. So it does not describe the entire United States as such. And therefore, there are just several locations which are being investigated. So it is possible that, for example, people who are poor, who are living in the outskirts of a particular city and as such have less access to medicine, are just basically sicker, and because they go to the doctors rarely compared to the people who are living in the city center, and so on and so on. So that is where the socioeconomic aspect comes in. So people who belong to different social and economic groups usually just have worse preventive care, and that is basically why this comes into play in how that influences their vital signs, because since they don't have preventive care, when they get to the ICU, they're in worse condition, and so on and so on. So we're expecting that maybe that is in some way reflected in what our algorithms are seeing. So this is not proved, this has to be investigated further, but it is a potential thing that we have to look into.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, basically I just wanted to point out that these two explanations are quite different, because one is about the skin color, which somewhat correlates with self-reported ethnicity, right? Because that's what you used, just self-reports, so people could say whatever they wanted. And the other socioeconomic status that you just commented on is related to basically racism. So how people treat different people based on their perceived ethnicity. So
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
there is
thanks.
a lot of proven, my pleasure, there's a lot of proven cases where it is obvious that just people are being treated differently because of skin color, which is extremely concerning.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
Now we have Mitya.
Thanks. Interesting talk.
Thank you.
I'm wondering about one thing that's probably a little bit connected to some of the other questions. So yeah, you've shown that race can be figured out from many parameters, and of course it can. That's hardly a surprise. I mean, for some it's a bit more unexpected than for others, but like SpO2, of course, if you shine a light through one skin, of course the skin color will affect this. But the question now is, I mean, in some cases, this is not really a problem If, for example, black people are sicker, and you can tell which people are sicker, and this is correlated with being black, and then you treat them differently because they're sicker, that's fine. You're supposed to do that. But if your application does something just because of the race and not because of the things that are correlated with the race, then we could very well have a problem.
Exactly.
And do you have some idea how it would be possible to distinguish between these two cases? Because that's what we have to aim for. We can't just remove all the information that's correlated with the race, because we'll be left with nothing.
So I think I might have mentioned, or maybe I skipped out on this. I guess one way of distinguishing whether the distinction between races is in a way positive connotation, or if it negatively influences the model, is by just testing how the model performs across different ethnicities. So there have been cases where, for example, there was a study which checked different severity scores in ICUs across different ethnicities, and the study concluded that severity scores were very different from what they should have been for certain ethnicities, for example, for Black or Hispanic patients. So that would be one way to address this, to have a difference in the sense that we get a model which potentially does this distinction. Let's see how this model performs on one group. Now, if the accuracy or whatever the measurement is, if this model has significantly better performance on one racial or ethnic group compared to another racial or ethnic group, then in that case, that is a problem, right? If we have, for example, if we're diagnosing something and then cancer, and then our model works better for white patients compared to Black patients, that is a huge problem. So just predictive performance across different separate ethnicities, I think, would be one way to address that problem.
Yeah, I mean, but there probably isn't any really good answer to this question. I'm not entirely satisfied by yours, because it's quite possible that, if such a thing happened, it's possible that something is a more difficult problem for one race than the other. I mean, of course, bad for them, or bad for us. I could be a representative of that race, but there can be something inherently different about them that makes a problem harder. Like SpO2, for example, I could easily imagine that it's harder to do this correctly if one's skin is black.
Yes, but that is a problem with the technology used. Pulse oximeters have already shown that they do a calculative error when it comes to darker skin. Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Pleasure.
There was a couple of hands raised. I don't know, Tiago, if you want to. Yes.
Yes. Okay. So I lowered my hand because my questions are somehow in line with what Mitya was mentioning. So vital signs are not the only way races can be automatically identified, and some of them are not because there's bias. It's just because there are biological differences, which may, that can be in melanin, and that may affect other things. So it's when I normally think about biases, I think that there's, as you gave examples, so there's not a representation of people in a data set, and that creates biased results. So that this is where my lens or my attention was. And here, I think my first question is, are vital signs able to distinguish race? And you answered that they can. But it was not clear to me if the reason is because there is some difference in these vital signs that is somehow related with biology or genetics, or if there's something at the collection. You talked about the examples of people, but I didn't see that as a proof. I see that now you have an hypothesis that, okay, maybe these differences are not due to something that exists, but they are due to a bias. And so what I wanted to ask, and not to try to make this more constructive, is what kind of signal do you think is the one where there is bias and you have some, or the collection was biased, and you can verify that data and somehow make the connection and say, okay, this is because of this problem and not so much. Because at this point, I'm not convinced that it's not just something that exists.
Okay, so wow, where to start? So the thing is, initially, we're not trying to just see whether the bias is in the vital signs themselves. Rather, we are trying to see if the measurement technology, the way that those measurements are being taken and so on, is a sign of bias. So whether the technology being used is a sign of bias, and that is why we're just focusing on statistical values. So we're not following entire series and entire development of vital signs through the stay in the ICU. The question of whether there is a biological difference between vital signs in one and then compared to other ethnicity is just well, up for grabs. It's an open question that has to be investigated in a lot of detail, because it's not just a question that one can easily proclaim out there and say, yes, there is a difference. We have to be completely sure that we can actually prove that in with the research. So yeah, not answering whether just plain vital signs can give us a difference between ethnicity, rather addressing whether the differences in the treatment of those signs and how they're collected can give us a difference in the ethnicity. So yeah, I think, did I miss something?
No, thank you.
Pleasure.
Now we have another question from Venet.
Okay, thank you. So I was part of this work, so
Yes.
I just wanted, to kind of provide a summary, especially to the first question, I think, that mentioned X-rays. I think what we are really saying here with this work is that using only 6 vital signs, information contained in them embed race information, which is something obviously unexpected. So we are not really trying to provide an answer, how should we deal with this bias, but we are trying to raise awareness that, if we use 6 vital signs in machine learning models, the models may learn to provide prediction in terms of race, and meaning that if you have a situation of life and death, as it is in critical care, then this becomes an enormous issue. So we don't have all the answers. Also, what Tiago asked, I think we don't know whether there are biological differences or not. Hopefully not. But what we are trying to do really here is kind of raise awareness that, those who are developing machine learning models should be very careful on how they use this kind of information. And of course, bias can be found in many, many other variables. But what's unexpected is to find bias in, basic units that are used to assess patient state.
And now a last question from Yuns.
Yeah, it's more of a comment. Bojana, I hope you'll forgive me. I just
That's fine.
noticed there's some misconceptions in the audience, but I'm sure you are well aware of that. Basically, I would just like to point your attention to this, the main variable in here, which is the self-reported ethnicity, right?
Yes.
So it's what
Yes.
people said
Yes, yes, yes.
about themselves. So basically, this makes the questions about biological differences moot, because we don't know anything about biology, and that's completely, in line with modern concept of race, which is that it's a social construct, not a biological one. So talking about biological differences doesn't really make sense if you are aware that this is a self-reported variable. And of course, it doesn't matter only what people themselves, what they perceive themselves as, but what others perceive them. And that's where bias, or in extreme cases, racism comes in, right? So
Yes.
I think that's the answer to this question, that we can't really detect any biological differences because we don't have distinct biological groups here. Rather, we have distinct social groups. And of course, measurements and methods in machine learning are also designed by people, so they have this social components to them. So I think that's the main point to keep in mind.
Yes, that's very eloquently put, actually. Yeah.
Thanks.
And there is nothing to forgive. That's great. Yeah.
So we are almost at the end of our session. If there is no more questions to Bojana, I think we can close our session today. Thank you, Bojana, once again for your presentation.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. And we hope to see you all in our next WideHealth seminar that will be on the 21st of February. Thank you all for your contributions, and see you.